At around 1 a.m. on March 1st, 1954, a 20-year-old fisherman named Oishi Matashishi finally headed down to his bed on the lower deck of the fishing boat that he worked on, which was called the Lucky Dragon No. 5. Oishi was totally exhausted. He and the other 22 crew members had been working practically around the clock, 18-hour days for the last 6 weeks, trying to catch tuna, but so far, this trip had really been a disaster. They had gotten stranded on sandbars, there had been these terrible storms that had nearly capsized the boat, and then also they had lost a lot of their fishing lines when they got snagged on coral reefs. And so, as a result, their tuna hauls so far had been devastatingly low. And Oishi and the rest of the crew were very aware of this. In fact, Oishi was very worried that he would not bring home enough money to support his family. Back when Oishi was 14 years old, his father, who had been the breadwinner for their family, had been crushed to death when he was repairing a ship. And so now Oishi had stepped into that patriarch role, taking care of his mother and his 5 other siblings. And so Oishi really needed a solid paycheck from this trip, and it wasn't looking like that was going to happen. And so Oishi staggered his way into his small room and he collapsed onto his bed, and as he lay there trying to sleep, he felt the ship gently rocking side to side. The ship, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, was anchored relatively close to the Marshall Islands, which is a strip of islands right about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. But what's unique about the Marshall Islands is they sit over these huge ancient underwater volcanoes. Now, these volcanoes are dormant, but the captain of the Lucky Dragon No. 5 was weary enough about getting too close to these dormant volcanoes in fear they might erupt, that he intentionally kept them about 80 miles or so away from the Marshall Islands. And so eventually, Oishi did drift off to sleep in his bunk, but 5 hours later, Oishi suddenly sat up wide awake because the little room he was in was now completely flooded with this very bright yellowy light. And so Oishi, he's kind of confused. He felt like it was too early for sunrise, and he checked his watch and he saw it was only 6:45 a.m. And so yes, it was too early for sunrise. So whatever this was, it was not the sun. And then when he went to the little porthole window where all this light was coming in, he had to squint his eyes, but he looked outside and he couldn't tell where this light was really coming from or what it was, but he could clearly see it was coming from the west, and the sun rises in the east. So really, whatever this light was, it was not the sun. At the same time, the rest of Oishi's crewmates who were in this room with him, they were also starting to wake up and kind of looking around like, what's going on here? And then without even saying anything, all of them just rushed out of the room and ran upstairs to the top deck to look around and see what was going on. And when they got up there, Oishi looked out towards the west where these lights were up in the sky, and he couldn't really see a clear point of origin. It wasn't like there was an obvious thing creating these lights. It was more like the western sky was just unbelievably bright and yellow and orange, and it seemed like the light was kind of hovering over where the Marshall Islands would be. And so everyone's thinking, is it possible this is a volcano eruption? Is there something else going on here? And then as the crew is just watching in stunned silence at all these crazy lights in the sky, the lights kind of began to fade and they turned blue and purple, and then they just went away and the entire crew was pitched back into darkness. And as everyone's just standing around having no idea what to make of these lights, the oldest crew member on board, who was 40 years old, he said the one thing that everybody kind of in the back of their mind was thinking about but didn't want to say. The oldest crew member just said, atomic bomb. Just 9 years earlier, the United States had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II. Now, Oishi, who was Japanese, he was 11 years old at the time this happened, and it had a profound impact on his life and his family's lives, his friends. Anybody who was alive when this happened, it changed everything. But as Oishi and the rest of his crew are kind of staring out to the west, which was all dark at this point, Oishi thought, there's no way this could have been an atomic bomb. Number one, World War II is over, so there's no reason a bomb would get dropped again. And 2, when those atomic bombs were dropped on Japan 9 years earlier, it vaporized basically everything and everyone in its path. And so for them to be this close to these huge lights, if that were an atomic bomb, wouldn't they too be vaporized? Like, they would not be able to see that and live. And so Oishi began to tell himself, okay, it probably was not a volcano eruption. It probably was not an atomic bomb. I don't know what it was, but we're okay. And while many of the other people on board the ship felt the same way Oishi did, Very quickly, the call came out amongst the crew to just go ahead and bring in the lines right now. We don't know what these lights were, but we need to head back to port back in Yaizu, Japan. And so quickly, Oishi and the rest of the crew got to work pulling these lines in and prepping the boat to head back to port. And then at some point after Oishi had done what he was supposed to do, he began walking his way down below to the galley to get some food. But when Oishi was about halfway, he suddenly heard this deafening explosion outside coming from the west where these lights had been, and immediately Oishi just jumped onto the ground, covering his head, thinking that was going to protect him. And as he's laying there listening to this unbelievable exploding sound, he's thinking, oh my gosh, one of those volcanoes under the Marshall Islands has indeed erupted. That's what's happening. And any minute now, a giant tsunami wave from this eruption is going to flip us over. We're going to get killed here. And so Oishi, as this massive exploding sound is going on, he jumps to his feet and he runs upstairs and he finds the majority of the crew that was still up there had jumped to the ground and they were just kind of protecting themselves. A couple braver crew members had stood up and were kind of looking out towards the west to see if they could see what was going on. But there were no lights now. It was just these crazy loud exploding sounds coming from the west. And then suddenly all the sound stopped and Oishi and the crew at that point braced for what they believed was this inevitable tsunami wave that was going to hit them. But the weird thing is after the exploding sound stopped, everything was totally calm. In fact, Oishi glanced over the edge of the boat and he saw the water was totally placid, more calm than normal. And after a few more minutes went by and no massive tsunami wiped them all out, the crew was like, what's going on here? And so as Oishi and the rest of the terrified crew on deck began exchanging wild theories about what these lights and these sounds could have been, ranging from, again, the volcano, or maybe an atomic bomb, or some said maybe an asteroid hit the Earth. And as they're doing that, the ship captain called out again, hey, finish pulling in the lines. We need to get out of here right now. We don't know what that was. We don't know what's coming next. We gotta go. Now, for reference, pulling in these lines was not as simple as it sounded. It was kind of a long and complicated process, and so Oishi and the rest of the crew, they began doing their best to pull these lines in as quickly as they could, but when the sun finally rose in the east, the crew on board the Lucky Dragon number 5, as they looked out towards the west, towards the Marshall Islands, they began to notice these weird gray clouds forming over these islands. And as the crew began to talk about these strange-looking clouds, they noticed that despite the wind blowing from east to west, these clouds, these weird clouds over the islands, were actually making their way towards them. Basically, they were moving against the wind, which made no sense. And so as these clouds got closer and closer, the ship captain was screaming at Oishi and the others to hurry up, get these lines in, we gotta go, we don't want to wait for this cloud. But it just was taking so long to pull in these lines, and before long, these weird gray clouds had moved directly over them and blocked out the sun. It was like it was nighttime all over again. And as soon as these clouds were right above them, Oishi and the others, they just stopped and looked up, and suddenly it started to rain. Except not normal rain. It was like this weird milky substance, like gray milky color, and it was also hot. And so Oishi put his hands out and he cupped all this weird liquid in his hands, and nobody knew what it was. And then before long, the rain turned into sleet, still kind of gray and milky, and then the sleet turned into what looked like snow. And so Oishi and the others, they had their hands out still, and they were catching these weird snowflakes, but they didn't melt in their hands. They just kind of pooled on their hand and just sat there. Now, Oishi and the others were definitely unsettled by this snow, and frankly by everything that had happened that morning. They really did not understand what was going on, but there was something kind of incredible about this weird substance that was coming out of the sky, to the point where many of the fishermen on board grabbed bags and saved some of this weird mushy snow stuff to bring back home, to maybe show their families and friends, or even to give to science to see if maybe they could study it and see what it was. And so after Oishi and the rest of the crew had kind of gotten over the novelty of this weird snow coming out of the sky, they just got right back to work pulling in these lines. And the whole time, remember, they're getting dumped on by this weird stuff that's not melting, and it's building up on the deck to the point where they have to stop what they're doing and shovel this stuff off the deck just to continue pulling in the lines. And for hours and hours they did that, just under this weird snowstorm. And then finally, right around noon, all the lines had been pulled in, and the ship's captain turned the wheel, and they began heading towards port. The next morning, Oishi woke up inside of his bunk on board the Lucky Dragon number 5. It would take several days to make it all the way back to port. And when Oishi woke up, he was suddenly struck with this intense nausea. And so he got up and stumbled his way into the bathroom, and just kind of out of instinct, he grabbed his toothbrush and began brushing his teeth. And as he did this, he had this weird feeling that his teeth felt like they were loose, that if he brushed too hard with his toothbrush, that he could knock his teeth clear out of his jaw. And then when Oishi spit into the sink, he saw there was all this blood. And so Oishi began to panic, and he opened up his mouth and he stared in the mirror to see if maybe he had lost some teeth. But his teeth looked okay. But again, everything felt wrong, and he felt so sick. And so Oishi, he left the bathroom and went upstairs to the top deck. And when he got up there, he saw many of the other members of the crew, and they looked terrible. Their skin was a weird gray color, and some of them had blisters all over their skin. And so to Oishi and to the other crew members, it now seemed kind of obvious that whatever was coming out of the sky, that weird milky substance and that weird snow that didn't melt, clearly it must be toxic in some way, or maybe it's led to some horrible allergic reaction. And so Oishi and the others began referring to the stuff that came out of the sky as death ash. And the fishermen who had gathered up a lot of this death ash into bags to bring back home were now too scared to even touch the bags. Like, they wanted to take the bags and dump the contents overboard, but the fear of interacting with that weird death ash was too much. And so there were these bags kind of draped all over the ship that nobody went near that contained this stuff. And over the next few days that the Lucky Dragon number 5 continued its journey towards port, Oishi and the rest of the crew members continued to get sicker and sicker. In fact, on one day, Oishi was outside unfurling one of the sails, and as he was hoisting this rope, he noticed the rope was covered in blood. And then when he looked at his hands, he realized it was because his hands were basically disintegrating as he was touching the rope, like his skin was just falling apart. And then in addition to his skin falling off, Oishi's hair began falling out in huge clumps. And he was not alone. Many of the other crew members on board the Lucky Dragon number 5 had the same things going on. It was like everybody was just totally deteriorating, and they all knew it had to be connected to whatever the heck they had heard and seen when there was that explosion and the lights and the stuff raining out of the sky. They didn't know what it was, but it could not be a coincidence. That happened, and now this was happening to them. And so finally, on March 14th, the crew of the Lucky Dragon number 5 pulled into port in Yaesu, Japan, and as they got off, they made this interesting decision to not tell anyone what happened to them. They all had this fear that, if it got out, that people knew what happened to them, that somehow they'd get in trouble. And so they all decided they would treat whatever was happening to them, but they would do it kind of secretly. And so Oishi, as soon as he left the boat, he went straight to the doctor's office, and as best as he could, he tried to kind of discreetly tell the doctor what had happened during this fishing trip. And then he showed the doctor all these lesions on his skin and the bald spots and the fact that he was so sick and that his teeth felt loose. And the doctor's like, I got no idea what's wrong with you. And so all he did was prescribe Oishi some zinc ointment to put on all of these blisters and lesions on his skin. And he told Oishi that, this should work, it should clear everything up, and you should be okay, but, come back if this ointment doesn't work. A few hours later, a woman was inside of her home in the port city of Yaesu, right near where the Lucky Dragon number 5 had docked, when she heard a knock on her front door. And so she put her broom up against the wall, she walked to the front door, she opened it up, and standing right outside was this horrible looking man who had gray skin and lesions all over him and all these bald spots, and he was smiling and his teeth were all red, like there was blood all over his teeth. And for a second she thought about slamming the door, but then she looked more closely and she realized it was her neighbor, Oishi. As soon as she realized this, she said, Oishi, what happened to you? And he just kind of shrugged his shoulders like he didn't have a way to explain all of this. And then he held out a small gray package and he just said, here's some extra fish that we caught on the last fishing trip I was on. I just wanted to give it to you. And the woman, who was still totally caught off guard by how terrible Oishi looked, she just turned and pointed at her kitchen table, telling Oishi to put the fish on the table. And so Oishi came inside and limped his way into the kitchen and put the package down. And then when he turned to leave, the woman stopped him and she said, Oishi, tell me what's going on here. You look horrible. You have all these bloody bandages on you. Was there a fire on the boat? Was there some sort of accident? Tell me. And so Oishi, he looked down for a second and then he looked back at her and said, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. Because again, remember, Oishi and the rest of the crew had decided they were not going to share details of what happened. And so this woman, who really liked Oishi and wanted to make sure he was okay, she just said, okay, you don't got to tell me about it, but here, have a seat, we'll catch up about other things. And so Oishi, he nodded and took a seat inside the living room. And as he sat there, the woman went into the kitchen and she got a cup of water. She brought it back and she handed it to him. And Oishi, he took the cup with a trembling hand and he sat there drinking his water, just looking so terrible. And the woman, she really didn't know what to say. She did not understand at all what was happening, but she could tell, Oishi does not want to talk about it. And so to kind of break up the silence, she just began talking about stuff she had heard on the news. And the big news story that everybody was talking about was the science experiment that was done out near the Marshall Islands. And when this woman talked about a science experiment and the Marshall Islands, Oishi dropped his glass and it shattered on the ground, and he just stared at this woman with a look of absolute terror on his face. And at this point, Oishi decided he was not going to keep his story secret anymore, and so he told his neighbor what had happened out on the water, the explosions, the lights, the rain, the snow, all of it. And after he did, the woman became terrified and said, "Get out of my house, go, go, go." And so Oishi, he got up and he kind of ran out of the house, not really sure what was going on. And then the woman, after Oishi was gone, she turned and she realized the package of fish that Oishi had left was sitting inside of her kitchen. And so she screamed and she too ran out the door. Over the next few days, more and more of the fishermen from the Lucky Dragon number 5 began to talk about what had happened out on the water. And as those stories began to circulate, they began to make the news all over the world. And as this happened, fish markets all over Japan had to shut down and destroy thousands and thousands of pounds of fish in fear that it might have come from the Lucky Dragon number 5. And the reason why everybody was so scared of coming in contact with anything that had been on board the Lucky Dragon, whether it was the fish or the people, is because on March 1st, 1954, when Oishi was suddenly woken up by the bright light outside coming from the west, and then there was that loud explosion, and then the cloud and the rain and the snow, all of that was not a volcano. It was not an atomic bomb. It was not a meteorite. It was not a fire. It was that science experiment that was talked about on the news. The US military was testing a brand new weapon that is quite possibly the most lethal weapon ever made. It's called a hydrogen bomb, and for reference, hydrogen bombs are 1,000 times more powerful than atomic bombs. Now, they detonated this hydrogen bomb far away from all of civilization. However, the Lucky Dragon number 5 was just close enough to this explosion that the crew on board the ship became the first humans in history to experience something called fallout, which is when deadly radioactive particles from this explosion get thrown up into the sky from the blast, and then they rain down on you like snow. That weird material they were feeling that they called death ash, that's the fallout. It's all radioactive. And in fact, the actual material itself that was raining down on them was coral reefs. They had basically been liquefied from this hydrogen blast. They got shot up into the sky, and then that's what fell down on them. That's why it wasn't melting. It was coral reefs. And so the reason Oishi and the rest of the crew got so sick and their skin began falling off and their hair began falling off was because of their contact with this fallout, this death ash. And so once they began sharing their story of what happened out there and it began making the news, the crew of the Lucky Dragon was rounded up and sent to a special medical facility where they were quarantined. And unbelievably, only one of them died. He was the oldest crew member who had brought up that maybe the lights they had just seen was an atomic bomb. But even though the rest of the crew survived, they would spend the rest of their lives battling strange diseases and cancers, and many of them would become sterilized, and those that weren't, their children often had birth defects. As for Oishi, he gave up being a fisherman and instead became a dry cleaner, but he wound up spending the bulk of the rest of his life being an anti-bomb advocate and author until his death in 2021, when he would pass away at the age of 87. In the winter of 2001, around 7:20 p.m. on the evening of December 11th, 2002, a police department in a rural English county called Surrey started receiving all these frantic emergency calls. Now, all of these calls were coming from drivers on a heavily trafficked highway called the A3, and they all were saying the same things. They had seen this totally reckless driver with super bright headlights that was weaving in and out of traffic and going at high speeds and nearly crashing into people. And then a couple of the callers said they actually saw this car go down the embankment off the side of the highway, and so it looked like they might have crashed. And so, of course, this police department, after getting all these calls, decided to send out a couple of officers to see what was going on. When the two officers got out to the A3 and began patrolling the area on the A3 where all these calls were saying they had seen this reckless driver, they didn't see the driver. They didn't see a wreck on the side of the road. They didn't see any signs of an accident. I mean, there was nothing there. Now, had only one person called in about this wild, reckless driver, at this point, the officers would have chalked this up to a mistake or even a prank. But so many people called in about this one particular reckless driver on the A3 that these two officers decided to just keep on looking and really see if they can figure out where this driver went. And so to this point, the two police officers had been just driving on the A3 to try to find this driver. And so they decided they would park their vehicle, get out, and walk on foot on the edge of the highway because there were these huge forests that lined either side of the A3. In fact, Surrey, the county in England where this was one of the most heavily forested areas in all of England. And so these forests on either side of the A3 were very dense. You could not see very far into them. And so these officers were thinking that it might be possible that this driver, if they were driving as recklessly as all the callers made it seem like, they could have veered off the highway, gone down the embankment, and then because they were going at such a high speed, they could have crashed their way into one of these forests and basically disappeared from view from the road. That in order to see this crash in the forest, you'd have to be basically in the forest. And so these two officers, they pulled over, they got out, and they began walking along the edge of the highway, staring into the forest, looking for a sign of a car wreck. And sure enough, after walking for a while, one of the officers spotted something deep in the woods that looked almost metallic or plastic. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be in the forest. And so the officers made their way into the tree line and began walking through all the trees. And as they got closer, they realized very clearly there was a car. There was a wreck in the forest. And so the two officers, they begin running towards the wreck. They're calling for backup on the radio. They get to this wreck in the middle of the forest, and they're on the driver's side, and they look inside the car, and there's no driver in the driver's seat, but they looked through the car to the passenger side, and they saw the front passenger door was wide open, and on the ground on the other side of the car was very clearly a body. And so the two police officers rushed around the car to get a better look at the body. And when they did, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It didn't make any sense. Like, what was this? Now, to understand why these police officers were so caught off guard by what they were seeing, we need to go back 5 months to July 16th, 2002. On that night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler finished up his beer at a pub in West London. And for reference, where this pub was located was about 1 hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the car was found in the woods. This night, Christopher had gone to this pub with a close friend of his. This was meant to be a fun night out. But, as Chris is finishing up this beer, he began to feel really antsy because it turned out Christopher was actually wanted by police in London for robbery, and so he hated staying in one place for too long. And so the only people who even knew where Christopher was the friend he was with at the bar, and then also Christopher's brother. He knew he was at this particular pub. And so finally, Christopher got so anxious about being in this pub for too long that he told the friend he was with that he just wanted to leave, and so he said goodnight to his friend. The friend stayed at the pub, and Christopher left, got in his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at the place he was trying to go. He just sort of disappeared, and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually would report Christopher missing, but remember, the brother knows Christopher is wanted for robbery, and so Christopher suddenly going on the lam and just disappearing for a while was kind of par for the course, and so the brother really didn't think this was a big deal. And also, the police felt the same way because they know Christopher is trying to elude them, and so it makes sense he would be missing. And so as a result, nobody really followed up on Christopher's missing person report. Everybody just kind of moved on. That is, until 5 months later, when all those drivers began calling into the police in Surrey about seeing this totally reckless driver careening down the A3, who eventually crashed into a ditch. And then those two officers, they went out to that stretch of A3, and sure enough, it was Christopher's car, and the body on the ground was Christopher. However, there was a problem. When the two police officers walked up on Christopher's car and saw it for the first time, they were struck by how old it looked. But it didn't really register with them why that would matter. It just stood out to them that this is a really, really old and rusted up car. But when they went around to look at the body on the ground, Christopher's body, they saw that his body was actually mostly a skeleton, which meant Christopher did not crash and die on this night, December 11th, 2002. Very likely, he crashed and died 5 months earlier, right around the time he disappeared. Now, the Surrey police, they say that this was all just one big coincidence, that the reckless driver that all these drivers were reporting that night on the A3 must have not crashed and actually just kind of got away, and then just by coincidence, when the police were searching that area of the A3 for the reckless driver, they happened upon Chris and his car. But remember, several of the drivers who called in that night about seeing this reckless driver on the A3, they specifically said they saw the car veer off the embankment and crash down below near the tree line. Like, this is a serious crash. Someone needs to get out here with an ambulance because probably someone's hurt. And then when the police got out and searched the exact area where this crash supposedly happened, they find Chris's car that had all the hallmarks of a car that was driving recklessly on the A3 that veered off and crashed into the woods. I mean, they found Chris and his car because of these calls, but it could not have been Chris. But what other car could it have been? As of today, we do not have a good explanation for how this happened, and so it's been dubbed the A3 ghost crash. Well, we finally did it. I don't know if it was all the acid we poured into their contact lens solution, or if it was all the wild predators we released in their house, but somehow, some way, we killed the like button. And I know this because the ghost of the like button paid me a visit last night. And after slapping me right in the anti-tragus and then pouring fox urine in my eyes, the ghost of the like button said, "Listen here, Mr. Ballen, if you want to bring me back to life and keep up with your antics, you need to bring me one piece of brand new Mr. Ballen merchandise." And I said, "Are you kidding me? Of course! We just launched a brand new merch line called Ballen Basics on shopmrballen.com right in time for the holidays. Ballen Basics has all your Mr. Ballen essentials like a sick hoodie, a great crew neck, heck, there's even a special collector's item, the old Sigalang pin, and they're all numbered. There's only 500 of them, so get them while supplies last. So again, go to shopmrballen.com. Ballen Basics is live right now, so get your new merch, get your collector's item pin, old Sigalang. Meanwhile, I'll work on resurrecting the like button so we can continue to find fulfillment in our lives by slipping some mayonnaise in the like button's peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Happy holidays, everybody. Go to shopmrballen.com. Mr. Ballen. It's not even funny. On the morning of August 2nd, 2017, two men sat together laughing inside of a bar in a tiny village in northern France. The men were named Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin, and even though there was a massive age difference between them, Lucien was 69 years old and Olivier was 38 years old, the two were totally inseparable, to the point where the people in the village referred to them as father and son. Lucien had spent his whole life working in manufacturing in a nearby city, but just 4 years earlier, he had finally retired and he had moved into a small home inside of this northern French village. But when he had first moved into this new home, he had been very lonely and sad. You know, Lucien was divorced, he struggled with alcohol, and he had had a really tough life, and he just wasn't doing well. But when he met Olivier, his whole life turned around. When the two met, Olivier also was kind of like a down on his luck guy. He was struggling with some health issues that made it hard to work, and so for years he had been bouncing between the nearby city and this village in northern France looking for work, somewhat unsuccessfully. And so when these two happened to connect, it's like they bonded over having kind of difficult lives. And for Lucien, what really mattered to him was Olivier, despite being so much younger than him, did not treat Lucien like he was this dried up, worthless old man. He treated Lucien like a peer. And so together, these two very unlikely best friends began kind of orchestrating their lives around the other. And before long, it was like their lives had all this new structure and routine and meaning to them, because again, the two men got to be together basically all day long. So on this particular morning, as Olivier and Lucien were together at this bar, they began talking about what they wanted to do that night. And they settled on having a barbecue at Lucien's house. Lucien would cook up some beef and they would sit out on his back garden patio and just spend the night together. It sounded like a wonderful plan. And in fact, the bartender would say that when Olivier and Lucien finally left the bar that day, that he recalled overhearing them being so excited about this particular barbecue. And so that evening, Olivier and Lucien arrived at Lucien's house and they went out to the back patio where Lucien had already draped a nice tablecloth over this small round table. It was a red and white checkered patterned tablecloth. And on this table was an open bottle of wine and some cheese and a baguette. And so Olivier, he sat down and began enjoying some wine and bread. And Lucien walked over to the grill and began cooking up the beef. Lucien had a neighbor. We're going to call her Marie because we don't actually know her real name. And Marie's second floor window overlooked Lucien's garden patio where the two men were having this cookout. And so that night, Marie did glance out and saw the two men kind of listening to music and goofing around. And she was used to them spending lots of time together. And she was also used to them staying up late at night. And so she figured, tonight's going to be another one of those nights where these guys are up late, having wine, celebrating, whatever. She was just going to shut the window and try to ignore the noise coming in and just let them do their thing. And so eventually Marie would do that. She would go to bed to the sound of music coming from next door and the sound of men talking. And then the next morning, when Marie got up around 6 a.m., she looked out that window again and frankly was not that shocked at what she saw. Lucien was still just sitting at the table, looking like he could be eating some bread or still drinking wine, and Olivier had clearly passed out on the ground. Now, Marie didn't judge. She knew these two liked to stay up late and drink and do stuff like this, and so she thought, you know what? None of my business. Then at 9 a.m., so 3 hours after Marie had first woken up, she left her house to go to another neighbor's house to feed their chickens while they were away for the day. As she passed by Lucien's house, she glanced into his back garden patio, and she saw Lucien was still just sitting at the table, and Olivier was still passed out on the ground. It was like they hadn't moved for 3 hours. But again, Marie's thinking, none of my business. And so she just kept on going, went to her neighbor's house and fed the chickens. But when Marie came back to her house 3 hours later around noon, she looked again into Lucien's backyard and she saw the two men still had not moved. Lucien is sitting at the table and Olivier is laying on the ground. And suddenly Marie's thinking, wait a minute, the sun is high in the sky right now. These guys aren't moving. They're going to get heat stroke. We got to do something about this. And so she yelled out to Olivier and Lucien, but she got no response. And so Marie just walked into Lucien's backyard, and as she got closer and closer to the two men, she realized that they were not moving at all. Like they were not breathing. Something was horribly wrong here. And so Marie, she just turned and ran to another neighbor's house. She told them what was going on, and they got these big pots of water, and they ran back and doused Olivier and Lucien with water, trying to get them to snap out of their drunken stupor. But the two men did not move at all when the water hit them. Clearly, they were dead. The next day, the local prosecutor announced there was going to be an investigation into the two men's deaths, which were being classified as criminal acts. And the prosecutor also said that it seemed like Lucien and Olivier died at the same time, and so most likely this was either a double homicide or a murder-suicide, and the primary theory as to what killed the two men was poison put in their food. And so police sent off the canned beans the two men were eating to this institution in Paris to test it for something called botulism, which is a deadly toxin that will grow inside of canned foods, but it came back negative. And then also police sent off the rest of the food the two men were eating to various other laboratories to be tested for poisons. And again, all of it came back negative. There was nothing that the police could detect in any of the food they ate. And so police were kind of confused for a minute, but then the autopsies came back for Olivier and Lucien, and everything changed. Lucien and Olivier were not murdered. This was not a murder-suicide. They didn't die from botulism or from some poison in their food. they died because of a set of very particular circumstances. Both Lucien and Olivier suffered from non-fatal minor medical issues. Lucien had bad dental health and so was missing a couple of teeth, and Olivier was suffering from a heart condition called cardiomegaly, which means his heart was slightly enlarged and somewhat fragile. However, his condition was totally being monitored by doctors and was under control. But just for a second, on the night of August 2nd, 2017, when Lucien and Olivier were having that cookout in Lucien's backyard, their non-fatal minor medical issues suddenly became a really, really big deal. Lucien cooked up a big plate of beef rib. Now, beef rib can be difficult to chew even when you have all your teeth and take your time, but Lucien was missing teeth and he loved this beef rib so much he was wolfing it down really quickly, and so he wasn't chewing it enough, and at some point he swallowed a particularly big unchewed bite and he began to choke. And when that happened, his best buddy, Olivier, sitting across from him, he stood up to try to help his friend who's basically dying right in front of him. And the stress of this moment caused his heart to seize up, his heart which is already enlarged and fragile, and he had a heart attack and died. And then Lucien, who now has no one to help him, continued to sit at the table trying to get this beef out of his throat, but he couldn't, and he eventually asphyxiated and died as well, hunched over at the table. A little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, 3 men launched a 35-foot white catamaran called the Caz 2 from a marina in northeastern Australia, kicking off what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. The captain of the Caz 2 was 56-year-old Des Batten, and for months he'd been training for this trip. And the 2 friends that Des was bringing with him on this trip were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69 years old. All 3 of the men had spent a lot of time plotting their actual course they'd be going on, which was from this marina on the northeastern side of Australia, up and around the north side, and then down the western coast to Perth, which was their final destination, and where all 3 men lived. In total, this trip was supposed to take 8 weeks, and all 3 men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending an entire 2 months basically just drinking beers and fishing. Now, Des, Jim, and Peter were not the types to blow off responsibility to go party. I mean, they were devoted family men. All of them had been married for 30 plus years. Des had 2 kids, Jim had 4 kids, and Peter had 5 kids. But they were all either retired or nearing retirement, and this trip was going to be kind of a way to celebrate the end of an era. And while all 3 of them had gone on other big sailing trips, this one easily was the biggest one in terms of the distance they were covering and how much prep went into it and how expensive it was. I mean, this was like 10x the scope and scale of any other sailing trip they had done. And so, on April 15th, 2007, shortly after the 3 men had launched their boat and kicked off this big trip, Peter's wife would call him just to see how it was going. And she would say, Peter was in great spirits, and she could hear the other 2 men laughing in the background, and it sounded like they were about to start fishing and maybe have a couple of beers. And so it seemed very much to Peter's wife like this trip was going as well as it could be so far. And so eventually Peter told his wife that he had to go, he told her he loved her, and then they hung up. Now, Des, who was the captain of the Caz 2, was adamant about safety being the top concern for this trip. Even though all 3 men were relatively healthy and had a lot of sailing experience, and even though Des was a member of a volunteer marine rescue group and so literally could be called on to go perform rescues at sea, despite all this experience and know-how, before they kicked off this trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through all these man overboard drills on the Caz 2 to make sure they knew how to do it if for some reason, an emergency arose out at sea. And so the men got really comfortable using all the life-saving equipment and going over all the procedures. And then also when they charted their course, Des stressed that at no point should they be sailing into open water. They needed to stay close to shore the whole time just because it was safer. And so when Jim began filming a video around 10 a.m. on the day they set sail for this trip, you can clearly see the shore in the background of this video, so they're following the course they had planned. But a couple of hours after Jim had shot that video on the day they left, a woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know Des, Jim, or Peter and had never seen the Kaz 2 before, she was fishing in an area called Champagne Bay when she looked out into the water and she saw the Kaz 2, a white 35-foot catamaran sailing east to west across the horizon. And then at some point, as Isabel was watching this boat, which really meant nothing to her, she just happened to be watching it, she saw it make a quick 90-degree turn and began sailing out towards the open ocean away from the coastline. Now, remember, Isabel knows nothing of this boat or its occupants, and so has no idea that Des, Peter, and Jim had been so clear about, at no point will we sail into the open ocean. It's too dangerous. Stay close to shore. She didn't know that. And so she just saw a ship turning and sailing out to the open water, and she thought, okay, whatever. So she didn't go and report what she saw. It was only later on, when details emerged about what happened on the Kaz 2, that she would later come forward and say, hey, I saw that boat and this is what they did. The next day, April 16th, 2 more people would spot the Kaz 2. These were 2 men who also did not know Des, Peter, Jim. They didn't know Kaz 2. They didn't know Isabel. In fact, these 2 men didn't know each other. But independently, on this day, they looked out near Champagne Bay and they saw the Kaz 2 sailing east to west in the exact same spot that Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, remember, the Kaz 2 was traveling from that marina on the northeast side of Australia all the way around to Perth. It was a point A to point B trip. There was no reason the Kaz 2 would ever double back and be in the same place 24 hours later, but here we were 24 hours later, and 2 more people are seeing the Kaz 2 in the same place that Isabel had seen it, and so that made no sense. But again, these 2 men who saw the Kaz 2, they just saw it and thought nothing of it because they don't know anything about this boat. It wasn't until later that they eventually came forward with what they saw. Then, one more day after that, on April 17th, there were these fishermen that were out in their boats a little farther north of Champagne Bay, where Isabel and the 2 other men had seen the Kaz 2 on consecutive days. And these fishermen, they spotted the Kaz 2. And again, these fishermen do not know the Kaz 2. They don't know its occupants. They're just seeing the ship. Except this time, the fishermen, when they saw the Kaz 2, they thought something was wrong, because they saw the Kaz 2 from a distance navigating its way fairly close to shore in an area that these fishermen knew was full of coral reefs. It's a very dangerous area to be piloting any ship. In addition, the sail of the Kaz 2 was totally ripped to shreds. And so the fishermen, they're looking at the ship, wondering what they're doing, but the pilot of the ship looked so in control as he's navigating his way through the coral reefs that the fishermen thought, okay, he knows what he's doing, so, leave him alone. But again, later on, they would report what they saw. It wasn't until the next day, April 18th, so 3 days after Des, Peter, and Jim had set sail, that anybody realized there was an issue with the crew of the Kaz 2. Because on April 18th, a Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying over the Great Barrier Reef, and they looked down and they saw the Kaz 2 with its badly damaged sails, piloting all around this very dangerous part of the water to be piloting. And so the crew on board the helicopter attempted to radio down to the Kaz 2 to see if they were okay, but no one from the Kaz 2 called back to the helicopter. And so as they're waiting for a response from the Kaz 2, the helicopter crew is watching the pilot of the Kaz 2 clearly, navigating the boat in between coral reefs. And it seemed like, despite the damage to the sails, he knew what he was doing. And so to the crew on the helicopter, this didn't really look like an emergency, but it seemed like something worth flagging. And so they called the Marine Police and said, hey, we have this ship here that's not responding. We think they're okay, but you might want to come take a look. And so the Marine Police, they would come out to the area where the helicopter had said they had seen the Kaz 2, and when they got there, the Kaz 2 was gone. At this point, the Marine Police got some information about the boat, Kaz 2, and discovered who owned the boat and who was on this trip, so Des, Peter, and Jim, and the police would get in touch with all of their families, and they would all tell police that besides Peter's wife, who talked to Peter on that morning they left, no one had heard from any of the men. They had gone totally silent since that first day. And so when police heard this, they knew this had to be some kind of emergency, and so a search was launched to find the Kaz 2. And 48 hours later, a rescue helicopter that was part of the search was about 80 or so miles off the northeastern coast of Australia when they looked down and they spotted the Kaz 2. And it still had all torn up sails, and it was kind of spinning listlessly in the water, and from the helicopter, they couldn't see anybody on board the ship. It was totally vacant on the deck. Now, at this point, authorities really have no idea what's going on with this boat or its occupants. It was possible that maybe they had been hijacked, and so Des, Peter, and Jim could be held hostage down below, along with the people that took them hostage. Or maybe the boat just got stolen, and Des, Peter, and Jim are not on this boat, and that it's just the criminals on board, and again, they're down below, hidden from view. So authorities, they don't know, but they decided to take a risk and just send somebody down to get on that boat and just see what was going on. So a rescue officer on board the rescue helicopter named Corey Benson was lowered by a rope where he was dropped into the water, and then Corey swam by himself over to the Kaz 2 and he climbed up the side of the boat and he stepped onto the deck, and right away he noticed it was kind of like eerily quiet on board the boat. There was nobody he could see, and there was no sign of any disturbance, minus the sails of the ship being all tattered. And for a second, Corey thought about maybe calling out for Des, Peter, and Jim to see if they were down below and could come up and solve this mystery. But then he also worried that if he called out, there could be some bad people on board this boat, and he didn't want to draw their attention. And so Corey was quiet and just began walking towards the front of the boat. And as he did, he began to notice signs that people must have recently been on board this boat doing normal things. Like, for example, there was a fishing rod that was cast out into the water that was anchored to a post on the side of the boat that looked like it had just been operated minutes ago. There was a blue mug of coffee that was just sitting on a table that looked like maybe someone had been drinking from it recently. There was a neatly folded t-shirt on another chair with a set of glasses on them. I mean, there was just all these kind of tells that this was a boat that was being used recently. And when Corey actually got to the front of the boat where the captain would stand, he saw the engine was actually still on. It was idling. And so Corey turned it off.
Dusty roads behind me now. Wounds are healed, scars fade out. With the dawn of a new day, I see hope light up my way. Stormy nights have come and gone. Lost my fears, found where I will belong. In your eyes, I see a spark, guiding me out of the dark. We rise, we shine, we're heading high, with dreams like stars up in the sky. From the past we break away, a brighter future starts today. Each step forward feels so right, endless days now lived in light. Courage grows with every breath. Together we can be what's left. We've been through fire, we've been through rain. Our hearts not free from all the pain. Holding tight, we face the sun. In this new life we've just begun. We rise, we shine, we're heading high, with dreams like stars up in the sky. From the past we break away, a brighter future starts today.
Now, at this point, Corey knew his next step was going down the stairs and opening up the door that led into the cabin down below to see if Des, Peter, and Jim were down there. But he also knew when he went down there, despite there being backup up in the helicopter and more people making their way out here, Corey would be all alone if there were criminals or bad people down there. But this was his job, and so after taking a deep breath, he turned and walked down the few steps, and he got to the door that led to the cabin. He grabbed the handle and he opened it up. And the room he was walking into was kind of like a half living room, half kitchen area. And he saw there was this table, and on it was a newspaper that was dated April 15th. so the day the Kaz set sail. And then on the wall behind the newspaper was a calendar where days had been marked off all the way through April 14th. April 15th was not marked off. But also nearby on a table was a computer that was still plugged in and on and looked very much like someone had just been using it. And also there were plates of food that were out that didn't look that old that also seemed like people must have just been eating from them. And then also Corey could see past this common area into the bedroom, and very obviously the bunks inside of there had been slept in. And so basically everything seemed like it was where it should be. There was just one problem. Des, Peter, and Jim were not on this ship. There was no sign of where they were. They were just gone. And there was nobody else on board the ship. It was just completely abandoned with no sign of what happened. Des, Jim, and Peter were never found. And so we have no idea what actually happened to them. Nor do we have any idea why they were seen by Isabel and the two men and the fishermen doing all these weird things, like randomly piloting out towards open water, which totally went against their plan, which was stay close to shore, be safe. Or, why on that second day they were seen in the same spot near Champagne Bay, indicating they had doubled back after going towards open water. That went against their plan, which was point A to point B. Why are they doubling back around? And so unfortunately, this whole thing is just one big mystery that has yet to be solved. Since you made it to the end of this video, I think it's safe to assume that you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. And so if that's true, this is your reminder that we actually have a brand new weekly show, a podcast, that's free and available on every platform right now. It's called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, and it's definitely a strange, dark, and mysterious show like you've come to expect. But obviously the focus of the show is medical mysteries. From bizarre, unheard of diseases to miraculous recoveries to strange medical mishaps and unexplained deaths, and all of them have big plot twists at the end. The first 8 episodes of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries are out right now on every platform, and this Tuesday coming up, another 8 episodes are going to be released on Amazon Music. Or if you listen on other podcast platforms like Apple